This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And even the board.
And I wanted to do a little bit of work with the structure for natural history preservation locally. We've dealt with federal acquisition of land, the Appalachian Trail, with others who've ridden across the country, and so there's a general realization that there's a federal government behind the acquisition of open space and natural areas, sometimes historic sites. But I wanted to look at the local area. First of all, we've had since way in the 1800s, probably 1860 or thereabouts, we've had a state natural history. It was a Department of Natural Resources, and it is responsible for gathering up and stewarding the natural areas that the state owns. It has done this for a long time. It works with groups like the Natural History Survey that was put together by Stephen Forbes a long time ago also, and that eventually became the Natural History Survey. They have groups that spin off that are subsidiary units that work with the Department of Natural Resources, and we'll mention some of those. Some of the ones that I'll mention are ones that I'm most familiar with, but Department of Natural Resources is responsible for licensing and permitting people to work on natural areas or park nearby or use them, or even when they're donated and people are allowed to live on them for some time. That's a major Department of Natural Resources responsibility. They also are in charge of permitting natural resources, like at Starved Rock State Park. They're concerned with both the natural history, but alongside there's fracking sand, and so they're involved with the geology there and the permitting of mining of that sand, which is very pure sand and useful for fracking. Not that we're always in favor of fracking, but that's their conflict, is to be in charge of natural resources and at the same time in charge of the geology underneath. I'm reading my notes here because I've been trying to put this together so that you would understand what we're talking about down to the local level. One of the spin-offs of the Department of Natural Resources is the Nature Preserves Commission. I find that to be an interesting group. Its responsibility is to find and work with natural areas, and it has a separate staff and management. It has about 30 employees, and the state is divvied up into regions. And their responsibility is to to sample the 13 ecosystems that are in the state. You have a very long, thin state, and it has at the south end bald cypress and the elements of the Mississippian Gulf, and at the north you have coniferous forests that are more representative of an alpine situation, and everything in between, including 2/3 of the state was prairie. And so the Nature Preserves Commission has put together an inventory of Illinois ecosystems and tried to define them, and that has become a demonstration for other states and other countries to do the same. People like Jack White and various agencies, including the University of Illinois, the Natural History Survey, various life science departments, the Committee on Natural, the Graduate College Committee on Natural Areas, and other groups have come together to make that survey possible, and it has been updated more recently. A typical quarterly meeting of that group would be as follows. First of all, you have a board that is half appointed by the governor and half elected. I think it's a 9-member board, and it is approached by regional directors, employees, and perhaps people who own areas that are anxious to see it preserved, or people who might want to challenge, for instance, people who want to mine gravel on a site that is good for hoary puccoon and other plants may want to object to a designation of the area being a nature preserves or a soil and water conservation district. That preservation usually includes sites and a list of endangered species and habitat, the water relationships, the relationships to roads that go by, and the state of endangered species, but also the state of invasive species that would just sort of downgrade the value of the site. But let's face it, the state has been mostly dug up, so we don't have good sites often. So sometimes you are preserving endangered species adjacent to development, and that gets interesting, and it involves decision making. So the board has to be educated about a particular site. They may or may not have expertise in natural history. Some of the board members may be retired natural history people, but the board may also include people who are very interested in the administration of these sites, and they will ask interesting questions till they find out what they want to know about this particular natural area. And that gets a designation. It might be a designation for a natural area or for a soil and water conservation easement, or other designations too. And then if there are questions, there might be that the presenter has to come back in a year's time with more information to back up the designation of or the proposed designation of the site. There's usually audience participation, which is often helpful, and often it's a chance for the board to say thank you to the person or the group or agency that's presenting the site for preservation. Behind all that, there is the like of the Natural History Survey, which has a mission of research, often into situations that can provide some grant money that might trickle down from the federal government, but it's often oriented to money to do research. So not everything is investigated, but the intent is to have on hand a record of what the nature of this state is. And most states have an agency like this. They have collections. It might be an insect collection or a plant collection. It usually includes other surveys like geology and water. So our particular Natural History Survey has recently been moved out of the Department of Natural Resources and into the caretakership of the University of Illinois under the rubric of Prairie Institute. And that relates to university research in life sciences and agriculture, ACES, ACES being agriculture, consumer, and economic affairs. And so all the departments that are concerned have one foot in the Natural History Survey. The researchers often have dual appointments. They teach intermittently with life sciences, biology, botany, zoology, and they also mentor students who are getting undergraduate degrees or master's degrees or even PhDs. Some of the research will be very specific and almost monolithic. Some of it will be very general and more systematic, oriented to group and teamwork. So the placement of the surveys in the university framework is academically helpful and appropriate, and that's where it is at the moment. Some units within the university, like the Graduate College Committee on Natural Areas, has been shifted over to the natural history side of things, and that gives us a little more chance to get some employment assistance, and it relates to other groups. It even relates to the like of fine arts, where you have planning and landscape architecture and art, because many of the approaches increasingly involve teamwork. So the university has a Beckman Center that is designed to encourage group research. One instance I can think of is the weather people have lots of numbers, but by employing artists who put colors on different pressures and look at and interpret the numbers to the point that the they started to discover that tornadoes have young ones on the side, and so there you have the opportunity for educators and artists to get together with academics in both places. There's an educational responsibility that is placed on the surveys. It's sometimes thought to be about 30% of their budget, but it runs to the publication of formal articles or vernacular articles that the public can use. The geology survey has always provided teachers with sample collections of rocks, for instance. Sometimes it is the provision of information that's specific, a specimen preserved, or maybe it's just trying to figure out what the local ecosystem was and what are the dynamics. How does it change with climate change? How does it change with tornadoes or burning? And so these things are of concern to local institutions, but the local institutions don't always know that this information is available, but the internet has made that much more accessible. So we're grateful to the computer science people who can bring this information to the fore and make it available to us when we need to know what might be done. So the natural history surveys have their educational responsibilities. They mentor their students, and many of those students go out into the field and study situations that we need to know about. The information may not go public for some years. The money may run out, but also the concern may run out. But the information is there. Even if it's negative information, you know that such and such doesn't happen when you thought it did happen. That means that nobody else has to repeat that sort of information. I'm just stopping here for a moment to remind you that the likes of landscape architecture have an opportunity to contribute here, whether it is in a streetscape or in a natural area. They're also a part of planning, and we need the theatrical people who might interpret the life of a wolf or the life of some small mammal or an insect, and create a dance which indirectly allows you to think about the prairie that was behind the situation.
We didn't mention at the top of the show that this is, besides the Prairie Monk show, of course, on Sunday morning, this is Sunday, February the 28th, 2016, and this is a program about the environment and other things of natural origin here in the state of Illinois, things that people might be interested in, including prairies and rails to trails, near and dear to Dave's heart. Mine too.
The Natural History Survey in its educational wing also has an extension responsibility, and for years they have tried on several occasions to bring together local environmentalists, but they're very various and they often have very specific interests, and it's hard to bring them together unless you have an overall problem like an aquifer that's being polluted, or a coal mine that's going in and taking water out of the aquifer and perhaps returning it somewhat polluted to a retired mine. Then you will get a regional involvement, a regional planning, a regional concern. But it's sometimes ephemeral, because after the problem is solved, then there's a relaxation of that regional planning responsibility. The Audubon Society is interested in birds and in habitat for birds and wildlife. The Sierra Club is somewhat more political, and they're likely to try and save a Muir Woods or something like that. The College of Agriculture may be interested in the agricultural aspects adjacent to the natural area. Isaac Walton League has an objective of buying natural areas. So when somebody passes, then and there's a contribution to a natural area. So you have different interests, and they all come together to some extent. And that's encouraged by people from the Natural History Survey, who often end up with those sorts of interests. It may be that they even have properties in Vermilion County where they might be able to study the river and perhaps give information to Vermilion County that they don't yet otherwise, and perhaps be on Audubon societies or native plant societies that are interested in, involved in preservation. There's probably about 10 or 15 of those sorts of organizations that do wonderful work. There's also park and recreation people. They're more interested in recreation. That's why they have a tax base. They have in perpetuity. So if a natural area is donated to the park district or the forest preserve or the conservation district in your area, then it has the possibility of being in perpetuity. And but there is a situation there that is recreational, and we have precedents for people losing their situation if they become too concerned about natural areas and not so concerned about the golf course or the trail. So our trail to Kickapoo has morphed from being acquired mainly for preservation of prairie to being a trail. The two can go together, but the emphasis at the moment is on a trail. The people involved are well aware of the prairie, and they've already done a lot to preserve that prairie. But it's there's a little bit of responsibility on their shoulders to provide for exercise, well health, traffic that is safe, and the prairie is on either side, and it may not get funded in the same way as the trail itself. The park districts are in there. Sometimes they're interested in being advisors to this sort of situation, or they also have the responsibility for being there for recreation. We have a Ccdc Foundation, which was formed because it was felt that there was a general lack of awareness for landscape and habitat in a relatively flat terrain that was not always interesting and exciting. So that was put together by people who decided that as a trust, the Champaign County Design and Conservation Foundation could provide you with trees to put on a natural area. They could support your work that way, but they could also fundraise for a particular site. When the opportunity for a rail trail arrived, Heartland Pathways took out an interim trail use agreement on 24.5 miles of railbed being abandoned between Urbana and Danville, or to be exact, between Urbana and Kickapoo State Park, which is very fortunate that the Kickapoo State Park is at the end of this abandonment. And we took it out. It's not the world's greatest prairie on either side of the ballast, but it's what we have, and we don't have much else. So Heartland Pathways took that out, and in order to take that out, they had to know for 20 years previously that this was a corridor that would work. You can't just race in and buy any old railroad bed abandonment because it might be in a strange location. It might not have a start and a finish. So that is happening in south of here between Oakland and Lovington. There was a 50-odd mile railroad between Paris and Decatur that closed out, and the Department of Natural Resources bought a lot of that corridor, 30 miles of it, but it's not. It has plots of prairie here and there that are very, very good, but there is a move afoot from adjacent owners to take that land back and develop it as agriculture, which means that we go from 0.01% of our prairie left to even less. So I am aware that the only place where there is any prairie left is on railroad beds and in cemeteries that haven't been cared for. And those two sites are fairly rare, and they don't get abandoned that often. So we need to look at possible abandonments for prairie preservation. That hasn't always been the aim of local citizens, because you can restore a prairie, but it's not the sort of remnant prairie that's been there for 6,000 years. It's with all the dynamics that it has made it change in time with weather and with other variables like soil and water. So the railroad lines are unique, and whether it's a rail or a trail, they can preserve prairie. And we have had a lot to do with thinking about that sort of preservation. So how do you do it? Our Heartland Pathways objective was to create a trail authority. This is a fairly typical way of working with a trail. There's a modern Rail Banking Act which provides finance and quiets titles and saves bridges and allows that railroad to be preserved, or that railroad bed to be preserved for the future as an interim trail that it can be used by hikers and bikers until the railroad wants to reuse it, and that might not be forever. There are now 20,000 miles of those sorts of railroad beds. So to create a trail authority is a little bit like working with the Natural Histories Survey, or I'm thinking more of the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, which has a board of 9 people who may or may not be educated about your request, and then there are a group of associates. I look to associates to be the park districts and the forest preserves that have the hi-ho and the equivalent to develop a trail. And so we were looking for a 7 or 9 person board with a CEO, an officer that you could get hold of. At the outset, it may have had to be a volunteer person, but someone with whom you could make contact. And then that CEO would work with associates. WEFT has associates, and associates approach the board with an idea. And the board is mainly responsible for what happens and to see that all parties get involved. That's where we may be wanting to work with the Farm Bureau or people who may not want a rail trail. We felt that a rail authority would provide more opportunity for more people to be involved, and that's turned out to be the case because the recreational people more regarded this as a trail, and it is being developed as a trail, and the prairie preservation on either side of the ballast has sort of fallen a little into the back road. We have people in those organizations who are very much aware of the need for prairie preservation and have done a lot to already preserve vegetation off of a 25-foot easement that has been taken for road widening, and truckloads of prairie soil with prairie plants have been transferred to other places like Homer Lake. But even so, the prairie ecosystem seems to get a short shrift compared with the trail and trail safety and the communication of people between small communities and trailheads and things like that. So we didn't get the trail authority. So one of the reasons why was that 70 years ago, the like of forest preserves and park districts were established. So they're established, and it takes a while to establish those sorts of situations. That's one good reason for taking it on as a recreational facility. And you have to watch that the railroad bed doesn't get so wide that it denies the ecosystem on either side. So the Champaign County Design and Conservation Coalition took over the Heartland Pathways interim trail use agreement, and partially because they were a trust, and a trust is an agency that can donate to other agencies. And that was handy, but the trust didn't manage to get the funds. But the the opportunity that Heartland Pathways had opened up remained open, and 20 years later, the same CCDC and other agencies like the state have come in, and the line has been preserved, and just recently the first 6 miles received a bid that is making construction possible this May. So the first 5 miles, 6 miles will be available after that. And that gives a little bit of instant gratification, which you mightn't have had if you had to have a trail authority or a consortium. But it still leaves out the other people. I just opened a legal document that challenges our ownership of some sites that we acquired before there was a trail authority or a interim trail use and rail banking act. Sometimes people do not want a long linear trail going past their back door. They have never had an experience of this. They want the privacy, but they also want the land back for agriculture. And so we're obviously in a situation that challenges our right to do that. So that means that we have to be dependent on the trails we have established, one at Monticello, which is very nice, that demonstrate to people that the value of the trail to the overall community as distinct from individual value as a farming site. Go back to the mid-60s, and a number of people got very concerned about the fact that there was no titular body concerned about prairie. You can always hug a tree, you can't hug a prairie. It also looks like weeds. Sometimes it is strewn with weeds, and it doesn't look very inviting. It also has chiggers and other creatures that may make it uncomfortable sometimes. But it is our ecosystem, it is our biology, it is our genetics, and we need that site. So with the aid of groups like the environmental studies, the Office of Instructional Resources, the Curriculum Lab, landscape architecture, various life science departments like botany and zoology, a number of people got together and helped us to do interpretive work. We worked with a revolving account, and people would have us sometimes to teach a course or to provide a slide or to orient to field work, which was painfully lacking if you realize that even into the 60s, the university was regarded as in loco parentis. That means that you had a responsibility to see that the student didn't get hit on the head with a branch of a tree or something like that. So it wasn't very common to do big field trips with courses like beginning biology, where you might have 600 students, to orient buses to take those students to the field and to have them go to the field without ruining the field was a challenge. So we started to do that sort of work. Then we gradually began to concern ourselves with the organizations. We didn't have a specific organization to preserve prairie. And so first of all, it was to interpret it. We at the time when Parkland College was being established, we started a reading the landscape course so that we could take people to the field and introduce them to some of these sites that they don't usually see. That was kind of popular. First course we ran had 26 people in it. It gradually morphed in the years, and the intent was to have other agencies take up some of these interests. The Anita Purvis Center developed as Busey Woods was acquired from the university to the Urbana Park District, and the College of Agriculture, now ACES, started to have things like Master Gardener courses and Master Naturalist courses. So gradually the interest evolved, and we assumed that the Reading the Landscape class would be taken over by classes that were more organized and better. We were looking for a prairie organization that would be specific for prairie preservation. As distinct from forest preservation, we have lots of waterways and places where tractors can't go, and there's forests there. They're often invaded with crud species, but that is a much easier target to preserve than a prairie. And what's more, it's very hard to find a prairie. They're on railroad rights of way and in dead cemeteries, so you can hardly find them. So we were looking for an agency that would do that. Then a railroad called the Pumpkin Vine, which comes through from Leroy to Fisher to Rantoul to Dillsburg to Penfield to Lafayette, Indiana. Railroad bed had on it a huge amount of prairie. So some of us walked it. Some of the people that walked it were specialists who knew the value of the site. So we eventually looked at 1 mile of short line prairie, and we didn't have the money to buy it. We didn't have the organization, but we had the sensitivity for an organization and the need for the organization. At about the same time, Peter Schramm was establishing the North American Prairie Conference, biennial conference, to do some of the same sorts of things, to alert people to prairie ecosystems and to have them preserve them. So fortunately, we had a conference at Mahomet, which was a prairie conference, and that, amongst other things, the course at Parkland College, the Audubon, Katie and Lois, two people who were very interested. We got together a group of people and formed what is now the Grand Prairie Friends. Some of those people are still around, but we wanted them to be a group that would be independent and free to do its own thing without being supervised by any of the agencies that might be specifically interested. We were encouraging, and they have indeed done very well. They have morphed some to the forest preservation and done trust work there that is to receive all sorts of accolades. But at the same time, it's morphed away from the prairie concern that we have. They did burn a prairie this week. It's a reconstruction prairie, a buffer zone around a remnant prairie. So the Grand Prairie Friends not only took over the short line prairie at Penfield, but it also has helped to preserve the Loda Prairie and a Bonnie Prairie at Watseka and other sites that have prairie on them. But I'm aware that there are railroad beds that are likely to be abandoned, and I would want to remind the Grand Prairie Friends that these railroad beds are the only place where you're going to find prairie remnants, as distinct from prairie reconstructions. We have a lot of very excellent reconstruction prairies. Meadowbrook Park is one, Lake Park is another one. The forest preserves have prairies. One very big one on the northwest corner of the Champaign County belongs to the forest preserve. So there are places that look like a prairie, but they're still not the natural prairie that was there and has evolved over a 6,000-year period. So there have been attempts to change the nature of the name of Grand Prairie Friends, and that was voted down. And I was kind of pleased that happened, because we were specifically concerned with the mission of this organization being mainly for prairie preservation. So the Grand Prairie Friends has acquired $1 million worth and more of natural area in the last year or so, but very little of that has been remnant prairies. Some of it is farmland that will eventually go back to prairie, but it will be a reconstruction with perhaps 30 species out of the 100 species of broadleaves, and the grasses will grow well. And it will look like a prairie and act as a habitat for snakes and birds and mammals that we want to see preserved. But we still want to encourage the preservation of railroad lines, whether they be active or whether they be a trail. And if the like of Norfolk Southern is thinking of taking out railroad bed, then we should be there watching to see that we gather up a little of the remnant prairie that's on those rail beds. In the process, we initiated a natural area study group, and that is a docent group that takes itself to natural areas in the region and learns about those natural areas and introduces them to other people. We also spun off a Heartland Pathways, which bought 33 miles of railroad bed between Cisco, Monticello, Clinton, and Seymour, and on the way into Champaign. So these are all attempts to preserve the dignity of the remnants rather than to recreate a simulated prairie. Some of those sites we may be likely to be challenged with people who do want to destroy the linear character of the railroad bed, take out the soil organisms, fertilize the soil, and use it for agriculture, not really realizing the endangered nature of the prairie ecosystem, which is there, that we need for genetics in the future. We may need some of the creatures there for a perennial soybean, if we can develop a perennial soybean that doesn't have to be planted each year, but is harvested like alfalfa. So we have to be prepared to do battle with needle courts to maintain that corridor. And one way of doing that is to have people interested and involved, because we do not have a lot of money to challenge invaders or encroachers. We have to survey the area, and we have to perhaps put down $15,000 as a starter to deny encroachment. And by the time we do that, the site has been ruined for prairie, so it's just like every other inch of prairie that has been converted to agriculture. We don't have it anymore. So we're dependent on a body politic of people who will really make sure that 33 miles is kept intact and that is utilized for the public's good, that is above and beyond individual work for a local person. So Grand Prairie Friends had an annual meeting just this last week, last Friday, and it was well attended. There must have been 75 people there, and the speaker was Elizabeth Back, who has grown up in Iowa near to Neil Smith Restoration, which is thousands of acres, and she is involved in checking out the microorganisms in the soil, which in one spoonful you would have millions of various organisms, and we don't know very much about them. We don't know how they'd be affected by various variables like sandy soil versus clay soil, or burned soil versus unburned soil, or natural history, prairie remnant soils versus replant soils. How do you change it? We've been very, very lucky to have someone like that to come here and investigate an aspect of prairie that hasn't received a lot of attention. And we hope that she will be funded to continue this field and laboratory work. So I see we're getting near to the end here. Let's see if I want to wind up just by saying, keep your ear to the ground, and remember that there is a North American Prairie Conference coming up in July, and it's at Bloomington, so it's you don't have to go to Canada or to Louisiana or other places to go to that conference. And we wish you beautiful thoughts about prairie and its preservation. This has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.